When I started on this project and I started studying the Federalist Papers, I did not anticipate that I would find a paper that I pretty much fully disagreed with. But this is the one. I just feel like there's so many holes in this particular argument. We're gonna talk about them. We're gonna look at some anti-Federalist arguments. So let's just get right into it today. So today we are looking at Federalist number 17. I know the people have been waiting. They've been asking for it. Well, I am here, baby, with the goods. This is the same subject continued, the insufficiency of the present Confederation to preserve the Union. Also written by Alexander Hamilton, published December 4th, 1787. And I actually found a couple of different publication dates for this. So I think it's the 4th, could have been the 5th. Who knows? Library of Congress website says the 4th. Says the 4th. So that's what I'm gonna go with. So this paper addresses a really valid concern that the federal government, with all the powers it's getting through the Constitution, is going to be able to supersede state rights. And Hamilton's argument is that no, actually, the concern should be that states' governments are gonna be able to supersede federal government rights. So, really interesting topic. I think that there's some massive holes in this argument that I'm going to be able to tear through, and we are going to look at some of what Brutus had to say, who was an anti-federalist. We're not really sure who Brutus was. There's some ideas, but nonetheless, we're going to look at what he had to say about this particular issue that people had with the Constitution. If you are interested in digging more into the anti-federalist argument after watching this video, of course, the paper is called Federalist Power Will Ultimately Subvert State Authority. It's a very timely discussion given some of the political debates happening right now in our current political climate, and I'm really excited to talk about it and get right into it. As always, I'll put a little paragraph symbol right in the corner so that if you want to read along with me, then you can follow along, you know exactly where we are in the paper. If you don't happen to have your own copy of the Federalist Papers, that is a-okay. I'll leave a link in the description. You can pick up a hard copy like I have from Amazon, or you can find the entirety of the Federalist Papers on the Library of Congress website, and I'll also link that below, so you can always follow for free, of course, because I love to give you guys resources. And as always, if you've got something to say about my interpretation of the paper or my arguments, or you've got something else to add, some context that you think will really add to the discussion surrounding these papers, please feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. That's why we're doing this. It's a book club. This is for everyone to be involved, not just for me, because again, I say this all the time, I am an enthusiastic amateur. I'm not a historian. I don't have any formal training in this area. This is all just stuff that I find really interesting and timely. So I dig into it on my own, and I am making the videos so that you can share with me this journey that we're going through. So with that, let's just get right into the paper. So we start with this very valid concern here, which is what's gonna happen if we give the federal government all of this power? He says, it may be said that it would tend to render the government of the Union too powerful and to enable it to absorb those residuary authorities which it might be judged proper to leave with the states for local purposes. So basically, Hamilton's argument that anything the federal government has any interest in being in charge of, whether it's commerce, finance, negotiation, war, those are things that should be under the umbrella of the federal government, and anything else can never be desirable cares of a general jurisdiction. So they wouldn't even be interested in taking care of whatever those state authorities should have authority over. This is a weak argument, and what Brutus says in his article that directly refutes these ideas here, he says, it is declared, and he quotes from the Constitution directly, that this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and the treaties made, or which shall be made, under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the constitution or law of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. So now, this is Brutus speaking. It appears from these articles that the Constitution and laws of every state are nullified and declared void so far as they are or shall be inconsistent with this Constitution. So it's going to be really interesting as we go through this paper to see how Hamilton addresses this concern, or if he does. Some foreshadowing there. So as usual, Hamilton is very dismissive of this argument. He's like, we'll address it, but I just want you to know, he just wants the reader to know, it's really not that big of a concern. So he says, for argument's sake, he'll humor us, that mere wantonness and lust of domination would be sufficient to beget that disposition, which, based on previous Federalist papers, you would think that the nature of man and lust for domination, you would think that it is sufficient reason, but I digress. He's like, actually, it isn't the state governments that are in danger of losing their power, it's the federal government. It will always be far more easy for the state governments to encroach upon the national authorities than for the national government to encroach upon the state authorities. And the reason given is that there is inherent and intrinsic weakness in all federal constitutions, and that too much pains cannot be taken in their organization to give them all the force which is compatible with the principles of liberty. So the federal government, in Hamilton's opinion, actually needs more power, not less power. And he's going to show us some examples. It's a really interesting tact to suggest that the vastness of the federal government's power is its very weakness. So let's continue. The superiority of influence in favor of the particular governments would result partly from the diffusive construction of the national government, but chiefly from the nature of the objects to which the attention of the state administrations would be directed. So it's not only the size of the national government, but also what the state governments do have power over that, in Hamilton's opinion, would tip the balance of power more in favor of the state governments. So far, I'm feeling like this is a bit of a circular argument because, like, how would the powers of the state government make the states dominant when the core concern here is that the powers vested in the federal government are going to take those very powers away? You see what I mean? So I'm not sold here. So Hamilton is really focusing his argument around the fact that the government derives its power from the people, and that the people of each state would be apt to feel a stronger bias towards their local governments than towards the government of the Union, unless the force of that principle should be destroyed by a much better administration of the latter. So only if the Union happens to have a better administration than the state does will there be an inclination of the people to imbue the federal governments with more power than their state governments. He reiterates this when he says the strong propensity of the human heart would find powerful auxiliaries in the objects of state regulation. In his very dismissive fashion, Hamilton says there are a number of more minute interests which he can't be bothered to list out and explain because detailing them would be too tedious and uninteresting to compensate for the instruction it might afford. But I kind of thought that that's what these papers were for. Anyway, for now, we're going to turn our attention to the ordinary administration of criminal and civil justice. Since these are the laws that people are most intimately involved in their day-to-day life, being the immediate and visible guardian of life and property, having its benefits and its terrors in constant activity before the public eye, and being that the state government will be principally responsible for creating these laws and enforcing these laws, this is what impresses upon the minds of the people affection, esteem, and reverence towards the government. To me, it seems like Hamilton is redirecting the argument from the fact that the federal government under the Constitution will be imbued with the power it needs to supersede the states in pretty much all things, to who the people are likely to have more loyalty towards. His reasoning is that this is the cement of society, that the fact that the people are more loyal to their more local state governments than they would be to the federal government is what would ensure them so decided an empire over their respective citizens as to render them at all times a complete counterpoise and not unfrequently dangerous rivals to the power of the Union. So while Hamilton is talking about the general feelings that people will have towards the governments, I think that he's kind of avoiding the reality of how the federal government's new powers could be used in practice. And Brutus presents this really compelling example in his article. Brutus says, suppose the legislature of a state should pass a law to raise money to support their government and pay the state debt. May the Congress repeal this law because it may prevent the collection of a tax which they may think proper and necessary to lay, to provide for the general welfare of the United States. For all laws made in pursuance of this Constitution are the supreme law of the land, and every judge in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of the different states to the contrary notwithstanding. By such a law, the government of a particular state might be overturned at one stroke, and thereby be deprived of every means of its support. Fair play, Brutus. Fair play. In light of this counterpoint, let's see what Hamilton has to say about the operations of the national government. He says most people, save a few speculative men, would have little interest in what the federal government is doing, and therefore it is less likely to inspire an habitual sense of obligation and an active sentiment of attachment. But that doesn't really sound like a good thing, right? Because what do powerful people do when no one's looking? The right thing? But Hamilton says he's going to lay some facts on us. He's going to bring the receipts, baby. He says, because the reasoning on this end has been abundantly exemplified by the experience of all federal constitutions with which we are acquainted. He says, let's take a look at these ancient feudal systems. While not strictly speaking confederacies, they've got a similar setup. There's a common head, chieftain, or sovereign. So like the national government, they have authority over the whole nation. Below them, you have subordinate vassals or feudatories who had large portions of land allotted to them. So in our analogy, this is like the state governments. And then below them are numerous trains of inferior vassals or retainers who occupied and cultivated that land upon the tenure of fealty or obedience to the persons of whom they held it. In essence, each of the feudatories were like their own kind of sovereign over the land that they held. So, like I said, in this analogy, they're kind of like our state governments. What ended up happening under these systems is that there was continual opposition to the authority of the sovereign and frequent wars between the great barons or chief feudatories themselves. The power of the head of nation was commonly too weak either to preserve the public peace or to protect the people against the oppressions of their immediate lords. Sometimes the sovereign happened to be a man of vigorous and warlike temper of superior abilities, and he'd be able to squash these feuds and maintain order by utilizing his own personal influence. But more often than not, the power of the barons triumphed over that of the prince, and in many instances his dominion was entirely thrown off, and the great fiefs were erected into independent principalities or states. But in the instances that the monarchs did prevail, it was chiefly owing to the tyranny of those vassals over their dependents. The barons or nobles, equally the enemies of the sovereign and the oppressors of the common people, were dreaded and detested by both. So in this case, Hamilton says that if the nobles had maintained the devotion of the people, then the contest between them and the prince must almost always have ended in their favor and in the abridgment or subversion of the royal authority, meaning they would win, the royal authority would lose. So in this way, Hamilton is arguing that the state's governments, due to their near proximity to the general population, has an advantage over the federal government. However, when I read this, what I feel is not being addressed in his argument is the fact that in feudal states, the populace is directly dependent on the lords and barons to put a roof over their head, to put food on their table. They don't actually own anything. But in a free country where we own our own land and we have a much greater degree of agency over our own lives so that we're not dependent on the federal government or the state government or the government at all to meet our basic human needs, I wonder how this might impact the balance of power that Hamilton is illustrating here. Anyway, the real world example that Hamilton points to is Scotland. The spirit of clanship, which was at an early day introduced into that kingdom, uniting the nobles and their dependents, just saying, by ties equivalent to those of kindred, rendered the aristocracy a constant overmatch for the power of the monarch, till the incorporation with England subdued its fierce and ungovernable spirit and reduced it to within those rules of subordination which a more rational and more energetic system of civil polity had previously established in the latter kingdom. And it's interesting how he just throws that in there at the end, because England's system was more rational and energetic, that it somehow doesn't warrant further discussion in this context. Because wouldn't England's government be about as far away from Scotland's populace as they could get? Yet they were able to subdue Scotland's ungovernable spirit. So I don't know if I can fully articulate why I think that this is a little bit contradictory, but I think you can see what I'm getting at. So as previously mentioned, Hamilton's goal is to show that the separate governments in a confederacy may aptly be compared with the feudal baronies, with the added benefit that they will generally possess the confidence and goodwill of the people, and with so important a support, will be able effectually to oppose all encroachments of the national government. So not to worry, Hamilton assures us that the states and the people within them will always be able to stave off any attempts on behalf of the federal government to supersede state rights. Hamilton finishes by telling us that in future papers we can expect to see more examples of Confederate governments, which will illustrate how the strength of the populace can be used. In summary, Hamilton's arguments are state governments are better situated to supersede national governments rather than the other way around, and that this is true because the population feels more loyalty towards the state governments due to their close proximity. Also, that the nature of the state government's responsibilities, being that they administer civil and criminal justice, put them top of mind for the average citizen. And then he rounds out his argument with an example of ancient feudal systems to illustrate how the powers that are subservient to the sovereign have more often been able to exert their dominance due to the loyalty of their dependents, leaving the sovereign more or less powerless. Obviously, I was left with some unanswered questions at the end of this. I feel like the anti-federalist argument in this context was more about what powers were literally given to the federal government in the Constitution, and Hamilton kind of changed the argument to be about who the people will have more loyalty towards, assuming that the reader is going to make the connection himself or herself and say, well, if the people are more loyal to the state government, then that will necessarily imbue the state government with more power. But I think that there's some other aspects of this particular concern, of the concern that the federal government will be able to supersede state rights, that aren't being addressed in this paper. So I'm learning these papers. I'm going and deep diving in them as I make the videos. So I do read a few papers ahead, but in all transparency, I'm learning as I go with these papers. And right now, this is like a really surprising feeling for me because I just did not expect to be so not sold on one of these arguments. So far, every single paper I've read, I've been like, yeah, that's strong. That makes sense. I get it. This is the first one that I'm just a little bit shaky on. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you got something out of it and learned a little bit more about the federal government. If you did enjoy this video, please like it so that other people can find my videos and we can even further the discussion and have more points of view. Also subscribe so you don't miss my future videos. Not only do I talk about Federalist papers, but I do all kinds of reading. I just love to read. So I like to talk about the books that I read, whether they're like romance novels or whether they're fiction, nonfiction. I just love it all. I'm a book fiend. Also follow me on my socials. I have Instagram and Twitter. I'll leave them linked in the description box below. And with that, I'll see you in the next one. Bye!